Okay, so we are live. Um, Today's chapter is on Seth. I think my first impressions on the chapter on Seth was everything that I basically hoped for, kind of, in terms of like the questions I was asking about predispositions. How do what are the roles that predispositions play when we talk about our spiritual just receiving and stuff like that. How does it affect us? And I think this chapter actually kind of gets into it quite a bit. It makes this first distinction between what I liked about was it you get a gift from the essence of God, and then you get a gift from what would be like the name of God. There's actually a third category where it's like the typical one where it's like you can request through prayer what God would have given you, anyways. But I think to kind of establish uh, the name of Seth and how it translates is that Ibn Arabi says that the name Seth literally means gift of God. Um, so I'll say I'll read one quote that actually I really liked, because I didn't know this was the definition that Ibn Arabi was going to give when he talked about gnosis. And so he says here on page 61, it might be different on yours, Chiton, I don't know. He says here, gnosis, according to our author, is not the acquired knowing of profane learning, but rather, as the Arabic root suggests, an immediate recognition and grasp not of something new or strange, but rather of the state and status of the things as they really are, have always been, and eternally will be, which knowledge is inborn in man, but later covered over and obscured by the spiritual ignorance encouraged by preoccupation with ephemeral and partial data. Um, the first thing that I thought about when I read this definition is I'm thinking phenomenology. That the whole aim of phenomenology is to basically just allow things to reveal themselves as they are. So I don't know. I thought that was like a very interesting definition of gnosis, um, where I know it's not quite like phenomenology because there's a distinction, but it's very similar in this fashion. At least when we talk about that, we're just doing this sort of passive witnessing of the things. So yeah, with that, I'll go to you, Chichon.
Yeah, you know, uh, there's a passage in between where I think things become extremely interesting. We're discussing the question, that mirror analogy, where the discussion is taking place, that what you can actually see in the mirror is yourself back. You can't see the substance of the mirror. There's a very extremely interesting point that comes out, and yet in just seeing yourself, you experience a mirror as well in that sense. That point emerges in that, and I think we can read that passage at some point in our discussion, and that is where I think it starts becoming clear in what way is he using this question of problem of revelation in some sense. In fact, discussion we've been having for quite some time from our earlier sessions also. And what does revelation mean for, I think, um, Ibn Arabi in that sense, and there is something about this problem of the real that comes along with God for him, that I think we need to think about, that in what ways he's not saying that there is any access to the real directly possible. He's not making a claim of that nature. He's just simply making a claim that each time you reflect yourself back, something of the mirror gets accompanied with it in some senses. And how do we understand that? I wonder how are you thinking about it in that sense?
Yeah. They, just to kind of, I guess, like clarify what you're asking, like, um, are we trying to see like Ibn Arabi's not saying that we can't know the reality. What he's trying to point out is that every time we attempt to know, we're always actually coming across actually the reflective qualities of our own predisposition. Um, okay, okay, yeah. I mean, I think this added like some real like nuance to some things I've been trying to understand in like a lot of my spiritual readings when they keep saying like, oh, you can't really grasp this oneness or this divine ground or God as such. Like you can't grasp him. It's impossible to grasp him. But of course, actually, very few authors talk about this idea that Ibn Arabi is talking about. They're saying that you can't grasp it actually because we're in the way. Like in some sense, we are in the way. And so there's this weird paradox of like, I'm in the way, but I'm also the only way to getting any knowledge of this reality, So I do find that fascinating that my predisposition is an obstacle and a path at the same time. And he talks about this in the chapter that the most difficult kind of knowledge is knowing your predisposition. Um, and so, in this sense, I think there is room to, because I know I wrote an article earlier this week about, Christianity and psychoanalysis, because I felt like these two, and it doesn't have to be specifically Christianity, it can be almost any religion, anybody else. But what I think psychoanalysis does is it becomes a tool for you to get to know some type of predisposition about yourself, or become well acquainted with it, or start to, you know, seek knowledge in that area of the self that is so hard and eclipsing. I think, it makes me think a lot about, how could we use writers like Lacan, um, with Ibn Arabi, right? This questions of predisposition, right? If I am always um, being in the way of myself, and there's always this reflective quality in reality, how do we use Lacan or Jung? I think Jung uh, had this. I mean, well, at least I haven't read enough Lacan to say anything really, but I know with Jung at least, like when he talked about, the shadow and the animus and animus, I mean anima and animus, you really start to get this sense of like the self that we have is a false self, or we could say a divided self. Um, so I think it begins at least in this whatever path. We have to acknowledge that whatever we think we are, there's more to that. And psychoanalysis always has shedded light on that idea, that we're very contrary to what we think we believe we are. But I will pass it to you.
Yeah, I think we can read this passage. It's an amazing passage. I don't know if you can find it. It's on in my book. It's on page number 30. But I don't know. I think our books are different or our translation is different. I don't know why is it different in that sense. But this starts from, let us now return to the subject of divine gifts, which we say derive either from God's essence or names. It comes in, I'll tell you this in a minute. It's on page number, the chapter starts, it's on page number one, two, three, fourth page of the chapter starts in my book. You know. So he says, as for the gifts and donations which come from the essence, They always originate in divine revelation. Revelation originating in the essence is always only through the predisposition of the recipient of the revelation, not through any other way, as you rightly saying, revelating essence only through the predisposition in that sense. The recipient of revelation sees only his own form in the mirror of the real. He does not see the real, and it is impossible to see the real. Although he knows that he sees his form only in the real, this is comparable to a mirror in the concrete existence. If you see a form in it, you will not see the mirror itself, although you know that you see forms or your form only in it. God manifests this as a simile of the revelation of his essence, so that the recipient will know that he does not see God. There is no simile closer and more similar to vision and revelation than this. When you see a form in the mirror, try as you may to see the substance of the mirror, you can never see it. This is so true that some people who perceived such a phenomenon concerning the forms seen in mirrors, thought that the form observed is placed between the beholder and the mirror. This is the best theory that can be known, though the matter is, as we have said and thought. We have explained it in Al Futuhat and Al Mahkiyah, I am not sure the terms. If you have tasted this matter, you have tasted the utmost degree of knowledge beyond which no higher degree can be reached by the created being. And do not strive and weary yourself to ascend to a higher degree than this, for he is not there at all. And beyond this degree, there is only pure non-existence. God is your mirror through which you see yourself, and you are his mirror through which he sees his names and the manifestation of the rules. And these names are nothing other than himself. So you can see what he's trying to get at. He's saying something extremely interesting here. He's saying that if you try and see beyond that, all you get is non-existence. You get nothing in some senses. You can only get God in the reflection that you get back. And because you get the reflection back, you can have the trust and the faith that there's a mirror over there in which you can see yourself. Otherwise, you couldn't have got the reflection. You
Yeah.
know, and how do we think through? And that is where I think your point about predisposition actually becomes so important, because that's what he's talking about, because that is what you get back. That is all you can see back, your own predispositions in some senses. That is how you can only become aware of your own inner orientation towards things in many ways. There is no way to directly get anything beyond that, and yet in getting that you have the faith and know that you could not have gotten it back, because if there were no mirror over there, in some
Yeah.
senses, you know
Mhm.
and if you read it alongside, say, the questions of ego ideal in Freud, in some senses, that is what you internalize the object in your ego, and then you look at it back, and you know one can see that there's a turn happening in Arabi of that, in some senses, that your own predispositions actually are not not they, they are they are the very guarantee that there is something out there, and you have to
Mm.
accept that guarantee in some senses.
Mm.
You have to completely accept it in that regard.
Mhm.
That is how you can reflect yourself back in. And how do we think through that guarantee in that manner? And it's very difficult to have that faith on things, actually. It's very, very difficult, because most of the times it's very easy to sort of escape into certain kind of abstraction, so abstraction of asking for something more than that.
Mhm. Mhm.
That there would be something more that we'll get, that then we'll know that there is something out there, and so on and so forth. So that is not what you know.
Mm. Yeah, it makes me think about if we bring up the problem of predispositions when we talk about like meaning, for example, when I think there's been a couple people say, like, there's no meaning, right? When there's no meaning beyond the certain mark, there's no meaning. Um, in some senses, when we talk about the real, right? When Ibn Arabi talks about it, actually there would be no meaning. You know, the meaning itself would only be sort of predicated on our predisposition. you know, it can only reflect. so much as our own. It can only take the form of our own predisposition, and I think that's a very unique way of thinking about, meaning, because outside of this guarantee of our predisposition, there's nothing. We cannot. We're asking more than what we can have. Um, and so I'm thinking, and it sounds very much like Lacan when he's talking about like the real is impossible, right? The real is impossible. So in that sense, like it has a very like a very Lacan, sound to it with that beyond these notions of ourselves and our predisposition is that reality cannot be grasped, and the only thing that you can know from the peak of knowledge of knowing that is knowing that you cannot grasp it, having that knowing, knowing what you do not know. um, yeah, I'm trying to think what else.
I think, yeah, I think in Lacan, what comes out, and I think one can read this alongside Lacan, says that Lacan, real is the point of resistance in some sense. In Lacan, it is a point without which you'll slip and you'll fall and you cannot move at all. It's that minimal resistance required for you to move forward. Like you have a resistance on the floor. If you want to make contact with the floor and move, you need some resistance, some friction on the floor. It is that friction that is real in some senses, like I'm thinking, that you
Mm,
need that necessary friction, for you
mm,
to find that find that bearing. So I think that
mm,
that comes out in Arabi's mirror metaphor in that sense. And then I think we have to think this question along talking about revelation. And how do we? And I think as the book will move forward, one can see that he set it up pretty nicely.
mm-hmm.
That he is setting up something about revelation alongside of predispositions.
Yeah.
And he's again and again saying that you can't get more than you deserve at that moment in some senses, and you can't get. So, and then I think it sets up the problem of that in what context are the God's name revealed to you in that sense, and how do we think through that revelation now, alongside this.
Yeah, I mean, like that question for me is like I feel like when I try to answer that spiritually, it's like, and I think why some of the questions is so difficult is like because most of the time I'm not taking in consideration of when I'm pursuing knowledge of my own predisposition. I'm not even taking consideration when I consider these questions. They're already playing as we talk. My predispositions when I try to think about these questions. Um, but anyways, I think well, I think there is a way, but I think it's with through some religious history that it's that paradoxical idea of self annihilation, where you get rid of the self. But the irony is that you're only purifying the mirror so that way you can actually see yourself as you really are. And this is something that um, not a lot of people consider, so to speak, right? We don't think about, like, what is it? They always talk about like the Buddhism and how Buddhism has like this contradiction about, well, it's impossible for you to not desire anything. But actually, if you bring up the notion of, let's say, like Christianity, you can you can actually achieve no desire. The realization is that it wouldn't be your desire anymore. It would be like, in this case, in Christianity, it would be God's desire. So it would never be your desire. So in that case, it's true. I have no desire anymore, but it would be or we could, instead of saying God, we could say it's the other's desire. And so in that sense, it's never your desire. So I think it is possible to have no desire as such, but I think Buddhism says it to such a degree that you understand that you have to constantly try to achieve this non-attachment, this erasing or purification of, like, my false self desires. um and in that process, I guess we begin to see who we really are, um which is some of the things that I've been thinking about when anybody practices certain rituals and stuff like that. Just trying to not do specific acts and stuff like that, you begin to kind of see some things about yourself that you do not see. um, but yeah, go ahead.
I think it's a very important problem actually in some senses for me. In that, and this is apart from what we've been reading, um, it affects me. What does it mean to actually, in some senses, um, purify yourself, as you use the word, or even it comes across, and I'm trying to find the paragraph, where this question comes at it, and when you're ready for the revelation in that sense, and how do you keep yourself in a certain state which is open towards, you know, and to one of the reasons I enjoy reading a text like this a lot is it actually orients me towards my own self in some senses. It's not simply an intellectual exercise. It can't be. Unless I submit myself to it in a very different way. So I can read, for instance, Hegel, simply on the basis of because I can understand the text. Either I understand. It's a philosophical exercise at some point. It's a reading in which I'm not saying. Look, I'm not saying Hegel is not great. Of course, he's great and all of that stuff. I'm just saying that I can read it. Uh, Knowing that if I understand it, I don't understand it. Here is not simply a question of understanding it at all in that sense. It orients you in a pretty particular. And I've been thinking about it last night. I was reading it, and I was thinking whether we'll meet today in the morning or not. But when I was reading it, I started reflecting back upon, certain questions that exist within myself about whether I have actually kept myself ready for a text like this or not in some senses. Those questions start coming to you. And in what ways does a human being actually start manipulating himself? That problem becomes much more real to me. At least it becomes real to me in relationship to the knowledge and things that I'm reading, things that I'm thinking. And somewhere knowledge gives you this illusion that just because you have read something, you know it.
Hmm.
you know and when you
Hmm.
read a text like this, it makes you real to yourself. No, it's not there. It's not like that. You don't have control over what you can know in that sense completely. It's not just because you read a book, you know something. It's not going to work in that in that manner. And how do we think through that, as academicians, as people who are trying to think, or as people who are trying to read different forms of knowledges, how do we think through that? That kind of a problem in some sense.
So I think, I mean, so I've been working through this myself, because it's funny, because everybody, when I read spiritual texts, right, the contradiction or the paradox is that people don't understand is that, um, in every spiritual exercise, at one point the master says that you need to drop it. You need to not do that anymore. And the person's like so totally confused about why they need to drop it. Um, and it's because you start realizing that any attachment to the form of the exercise, to the feelings that you get from the exercising, that you're somehow achieving something, that you're somehow gaining something, is really a false. It's all false in that sense, because you're not really, like you had said before, you're not actually knowing anything. Um, and this is why, for me, I start thinking, like, that's why it makes sense that I'm actually not knowing anything, because in the text here it says that man already innately knows, but things have obscured us. So when I'm working through these contradictions, and I think this is why maybe Hegel is like, pretty beneficial to read, is that you start understanding like everything that you do involves like some type of contradiction, you know, some type of paradox that you have to sort of see for yourself that this is the contradiction or this is the paradox that you're caught in, and that whatever you think you know, that's not it. And for me, that's as far as I've gotten in my thinking. I mean, it's helped me a lot, because now I know whatever spiritual activity I feel or go through, I know that ultimately it is myself that I am sort of encountering in some way, that I am the medium for this, thing. Um, so yeah, it's been so hard because so many people have questions about this type of stuff. How do you annihilate the self? How do you, like you had said, how do you purify yourself? And all I can say is regurgitate what people have said in the past, right? Cultivating some holy indifference, cultivating some non-attachment. But I don't know what that means. I don't really know what that means because there's this gap between my experience and what people are saying. And so I ultimately always go back to I just don't know. I really don't know at all. Um, so I'm always facing myself in that sense. Um, but yeah, I'll let you go, Chitan.
Yeah, I found one of the sections where this comes out very interestingly. Um, Again, I'm just reading from the, I think, starting third page or something. You among the people of God, this kind of people who do not request are higher and more receptive to revelation than others, because they perceive the mystery of God's predetermination. And this is where I'm trying to think through this question of like, what does it mean to say you're requesting God for something? You know, is my reading of philosophy, is my reading of these texts that requested something? They are divided into two groups: those who know it, the mystery in a general way, and those who know it in a detailed manner, in a particular way, which means. So, as I said, you can read, I can read Hegel, I can read Kant, and they're very important texts, but I do know things in a general way in that sense. I can talk about them, but, what does it mean to know them in a particular, in a detailed manner in that sense? One who knows it in a detailed way is higher and more complete than who knows it in a general way. For the former knows that which God knows about him, whether through God's notification to him of the knowledge latent in his fixed entity or his revelation to him of his fixed entity, whose states are endless and ever changing. Such a one is higher than the one who knows in a general way. That is because his knowledge of himself is like God's knowledge of him. So it's not like the God. It's like your knowledge of your own self is like the way God knows you. So the source of knowledge for the source of knowledge is one. There are no multiple sources of knowledge in that sense. However, from the point of view of the servant, his knowledge of himself derives from God's previous providence, which consists of God's revelation to him of all the states of his entity. When God makes the created being know the fixed states of his entity, he knows them as concrete existence, and he cannot know them in a state of their absence, for their essential relationships, having no form. In this respect, we say that the two kinds of knowledge, God and the human beings, are equal and originate in God's previous providence. One can see something really interesting emerging here in that sense. That when he's saying that there are no two kinds of knowledges, what he's essentially saying that your knowledge of your own self is God's knowledge of you in some senses. And if when you start thinking about that more seriously, he's asking you to let go of that anxiety that you don't know God. That is not important in that sense. The very fact of knowing yourself actually, and then there are two forms of knowing in that. One is knowing in this generic manner that okay, you understand this, you understand that through a book, and you understand that through and the other is to know it in a um, very particular detailed sense in that sense, which is certain act of living it is and how do we think to what that particularity I guess is where I'm getting at.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, I think it, like you said, like when I read philosophy, is this only me knowing things in a general way? You know, is this me only knowing things in the abstract way? Um, or is it that actually every knowledge almost that isn't focused on the knowing of the self would be, just a general knowledge that every time I walk outside, I get some general knowledge. I get a particular knowledge of the world, but I get a general knowledge of myself just because I'm interacting with it, you know. But I never get a really detailed understanding. So I think it presents something that is rather interesting. And when you ask those questions, what does it mean to know yourself in detail? This raises the questions of like psychology, right? Is psychology the proposed method to know ourselves in detail? you know, what is psychology really doing when we compare it to what Ibn Rabi is saying? You know, is psychology still something that is general proposition of ourselves? Um, this is something that I'm interested about. How would we work that out? Because the psychology is aimed at trying to know ourselves in such a way, in this detailed way. Um, but yeah, I wouldn't even know. I wouldn't even know how to begin what it means to know something in such particular detail. I mean, but what's interesting about this text, Chitan, and the way the chapter ends, is that Ibn Rabi says something very in detail, right? He talks about this coming of a Chinese man, that he's gonna say things, and this woman that's gonna come before him, and this will be the last sign, and after that it will be like the fall of mankind basically again. So I find it intriguing that it gets brought up about this general to detail, and then the chapter ends with this very specific detail. um so I'm kind of interested in that. But yeah, pass it to you.
Definitely. I think just to sort of add to what you were saying before, um, I remember Doris saying in her biography, at least, writing somewhere that, essentially, if you look at religion, I think religion's one purpose across human, cultures would be that religion doesn't allow you to settle with what you've got so far in some senses. If you've grown a certain bit spiritually in certain exercise, certain manner, religion will ask you to be humble enough to say move further from here. Because it gets very easy to be complacent about it. Oh, now I know. So I think most religions have that sense in them that they will you know beat you down to certain kind of practical side. I remember, say, if you read through certain kind of Buddhist poems, the Sufi stories or Sufi poems, one of the earliest say ways that at least I was taught how to interpret them was not to get into the temptation that you can know what they are saying because you know that is the only answer possible. In fact, the very fact that they can be interpreted in a multiple of ways, you know, is the terrain at which you have to actually uncork or unravel its interpretation for yourself in some senses, and that comes through certain experience. So, for instance, when you read Rumi or when you read, the one way is to ask the question that how can I narrow that interpretation down to one interpretation which the author is giving me or something of that nature. Some kind of academic exercises do that. The other way to actually ask that question is that in what ways does what Rumi is saying becomes useful to what I'm thinking, and there the multiple interpretations actually open up for you. You do not try and narrow them down. You, in fact, you are very okay with that multiplicity in those in those orders. And then Arabi was also saying that you don't ask for more in it. You are simply asking for what you've got. You're simply registering what you've got, and you're being very honest about this is what I understand. And so for instance, the famous cone in that sense when a teacher actually gives a student one leaf and he asks student to go and search for another leaf of the same shape, and the student keeps on searching for it until it occurs to him that there cannot be any two things of the same shape possible. That exercise keeps on going forward, and it doesn't occur to him because that's the only explanation possible. No, it's not. It is something that comes to student through that practice itself. It is not a logical game where he has to derive it in some sense. He doesn't have to derive it. He just has to be honest about the very exercise that he has to go and search for it.
Mhm.
And for most of us, that honesty is very, very difficult. It's very difficult to achieve, actually. It is for me when I think about myself. You know, it's an extremely hard thing to be extremely honest with what you've been tasked with. It's much more easier to have this general way of knowing things in that sense, where I already know that those two things cannot be. In fact, if I wonder sometimes if I'm put to that task, what would happen is that my generic conception of the world would already give me a certain knowledge which would be without the practice of that, do going through that exercise and actually finding it for myself. And it would be much more harder for a teacher to teach me because of that. It won't make my life easier. It would make my life much more difficult in some senses. So there's no light here, yeah. I hope I don't know whether you get it or not, but yeah, that kind of a challenge emerges from there.
Mhm. Yeah, it's the same thing with yeah, it I experience this all the time, because I read texts like this or any other, super spiritual text, and again, people ask me questions and it's like I could give you the answer because in generally I know the answer, but it's like I at the same time, right? Like what you're talking about is like I don't know because I haven't done it. I haven't done the work per se to know it in detail, and I think there is a difference with that, and but I also think because Ibn Arabi talks about this, the guys that do know, it's like they almost don't even say anything else. They say nothing. They're like silent about it. So it it kind of baffles me that it actually reminds me of the Heidegger talk with the monk where they keep asking questions and they say if you say it out loud, like then it's gone, we don't have it anymore. um which I always feel like Heidegger kind of really danced on these type of sides of truth where it's like, if you talk about it, you're not really talking about it. you know so but yeah, I've been trying to think, how does one stop this idea of thinking that I know anything and then using the utility of what you're talking about, the interpretations. um, because I do find it interesting that whether somebody is religious or not, that we always want to work out this idea of multiplicity and unity. We always want to work this out. But actually, I think the way that Ibn Arabi is proposing this is he's saying that there's really nothing to work out, so to speak, right? And like that's the funny part about the many and the one is that you are the many because of the one, and you can only know the one because you are the many. And it's only through the many that you can even get a fathom or a conception, a form of the reality, the one. So it's like when people try to reconcile this, I think it's almost like, I think the way Ibn Rabi is saying is that you're missing the point. You're missing the point by trying to reconcile this many in oneness. That's not the point. The point is to see yourself as many as you are, as you have been, um, and and that totally redirects everything, um, everything that I ever thought about. Um, it makes me even question, like, why am I reading specific texts? Um, let's say if I'm not doing this, but I think that the trick part of me asking myself that question of, like, I'm saying, well, why am I reading, Hegel? Why am I reading Lacan? I may not have an answer explicitly, but I think my predisposition might be taking a role in that carrying forth of it being sort of like my way, or my predisposition's way of gaining that form of reality, that sort of self-reflection. So I think that's interesting to think about. um yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not arguing that reading Hegel or Lacan is not helpful or something like that. Sometimes that
Yeah.
can influence someone. What I'm saying is that how to be honest towards reading them in that sense.
Hmm.
You know, that's the kind of question. And you're right, somewhere in Heidegger, that very authenticity towards the outside comes out. But that's what Heidegger's problem with Hegel in some sense is, and we can have a get into that kind of a discussion. But I think what Heidegger is trying to sort of think through is that how do you remain authentic towards the outside? How do you remain in some senses extremely honest towards what is outside in that sense? And and you do not try and be greedy for it in some senses, as and even in Arabi, as we pointed out before, there's a point that you do not push for what you don't know. There is a certain honesty about it, and even when you're saying that you don't need to reconcile it, I actually agree with you. I can see where you're coming from completely over there, and it's a fantastic way to put it. That it is not a question of reconciling these things. In fact, I think for a lot of long time, human knowledge has been struggling with trying to reconcile these things in some senses. There's a lot of energy getting wasted in that reconciliation, which is actually not needed if you really think about it. There are certain things which can be simply which can be simply taken as points from which new knowledge can be created. And I think that's something Lacan understands in some sense. Is that for Lacan, the point of gap, a point of contradiction, is not this meaninglessness, this sadness, or no, it's not that. It's in fact the very point of human creativity. There is a contradiction which is, and let's see what can emerge from using that contradiction, from playing with it, from actually orienting ourselves in that positive manner towards it, rather than simply getting you know anxious about resolving that contradiction. And a lot of philosophical uh, time gets engaged in trying to resolve these contradictions in some senses, in trying to bring the many and the one to it, and
Mhm.
thinking, oh, we have some now. you know
Yeah, it almost makes me think, like, when we talk about philosophers trying to solve contradictions, it makes me think that this idea itself, this reconciliation, I think there's an interpretation to say that God is dead, has like, there's a paradigm into which this attempt of reconciliation attributes to the idea of God is dead. I think, um, at least accepting this paradigm of this, and I think that's why when Nietzsche comes in and he talks about that man is a bridge, um, this is brilliant. The fact that just man is a bridge, um, this would display that really there is actually the contradiction is this: we are looking for the reconciliation, right? But we are the reconciliation when we take the idea of what Nietzsche has said before, that man is the bridge, that we are the only things that can possibly know it and not know it. We our predisposition carries that. Um, but you're right. I mean, there Ibn Rabi does talk about this aspect of, you know, if my predisposition has a certain degree of knowing, your predisposition carries itself another degree of knowing. And it could be lesser or higher than mine, but it's like I have to have enough knowledge to accept and know that this is my degree and this is where I'm at. And like, that's it. Because actually, I think the way some people would interpret this is they'll be like, oh, well, then you're disadvantaged in some way. If you have a lesser degree, how could this happen, and so on. It's not equal, right? It's not equal at all. But um, it is equal in the sense of that our existence and our predispositions are specific gifts and come from specific names of God Himself. So in that sense, it's not unequal in any way. But it takes a lot of self-knowledge and knowing to know that my marking is here and his marking is there. And this is where I meet the lines. But trying to express this, trying to translate this in, like, maybe say like the political realm, I wouldn't even know where to begin. I feel like there is such a gap of interpretation, talking about stuff like this to like the culture today. Um, just normal people about stuff like this today. I mean, this would be ridiculous, really. It's on the verge of ridiculous, for some people. So it does,
Yeah.
you know.
What you're saying actually is extremely important in some senses, because when Arabi says that people do not request are actually higher, what he means is that if you can't be honest to where you are in some senses, and when you start thinking about this inequality that you've been talking about, and it's an interesting, it is also a way to be honest to your own self. Without, if everything is equal, you can't. There's no way to be honest to yourself. Oh, everything is equal. It's a generic statement, isn't it? It's only way to be honest to yourself is to accept that inequality completely, to affirm it, and that's what you're right at this there in Nietzsche. Nietzsche actually understands that the only way to overcome it is to actually completely radically affirm it. You know, that is where his long essays on cruelty and his long essays on pain, actually those things become extremely relevant, because he would say, there's a pleasure in giving somebody pain, and you have to accept that pleasure first to actually overcome that pleasure in some senses. It's only the highest man that can forgive. First learn how to punish in some senses, and now, so one can see that there is something about that honesty to your own self that allows certain path to open for yourself. And that honesty is not about simply knowing things in this you know philosophical classroom manner, in that sense. It has something to do with developing a relationship with knowing your own self. And how do we think through that work that man has to do with himself? And it is not the same work that you simply do in any intellectual tradition. And I think knowledge today actually is reaching a point where it can't move forward without that work being incorporated in our intellectual tradition itself. We have gained a lot of knowledge, a lot of ways of doing things, without actually incorporating this part of the human self, for whatever
Mm,
reasons.
mhm,
Human beings actually have reached its peak point, beyond which this movement is not possible unless human being in some senses acknowledges that work that he has to do to actually understand what he has already discovered in a lot of ways. And how do we think through that work? I think if you read, I think we should read the last paragraph at some stage. It's an extremely interesting paragraph, as you rightly said. You know,
mhm. Yeah, you want to
so,
read it, Chitan?
do I? Yeah, I'm reading the last page of the text.
Mhm.
However, some people of speculation who are weak minded hold that since it has been proved that God does what he wants, it is possible for him to do things contrary to wisdom and to the real state of things. Consequently, some speculative thinkers come to deny possibility or contingency and to affirm the necessity through the essence or through another entity. One who verifies affirms possibility and its attendance. He knows what the possible thing is, what turns it into a possible thing, and that it is necessary by virtue of another. He also knows why it is legitimate to designate that it requires necessity of another thing. Only those who know God are aware of the distinction between these terms. Last born individual of a human species will follow the footsteps of Seth and bear Seth's mysteries. There will be no other offspring of this species, and he will be its seed. His sister will be born with him, and he will emerge after her, his head lying at her feet. He will be born in China and speak Chinese. Infertility will spread among men and women, and there will be many marriages without procreation. He will call them to God, but they will not respond. When God will make him and the believer of his time die, those who remain will live like animals, not permitting the lawful and not prohibiting the unlawful. They will behave as dictated by nature and passion without any regard for intellectual religion. Because of them, the last hour will take place. Can you see? How do you interpret this? This is where he gets really, Nietzschean in some senses. So,
Yeah, yeah. I when I read that, for me it almost came out of nowhere, um, and I keep thinking like the one thing I asked myself to Tom when I read this, I said, I wonder who it is because it feels like he's already passed. It feels like he's already passed, but I don't even know if he's passed. And so there's so many, and I'm just wondering if does this need to be interpreted in such a way as it being a real man, and so on, or is it sort of like I don't know, but it, it it sounds really resonant of it being a real man. So it's something that just really took me off guard about this um, whole idea of that the sterility will then overcome. Um, one of the first things that I'm always been told about China is that China is overpopulated. So that's why I started thinking like, oh, maybe it already happened. um, but I'm not sure. I mean, how did you think about this last passage? The with
I
the
think, I think there's something to do with when you think about birth. At least to my mind, what comes across is, and I'm not trying to interpret the passage and say this is the meaning of it in some senses.
Yeah,
That's not my aim. But one thing to do over here is that you need to think about birth with newness. You know that giving birth to something actually involves giving birth to something new.
mm,
Something new comes to the world, which cannot be predicted, which cannot be calculated in advance. That is what, and one of the struggles with human pleasure always has been that when we want to give birth to something new, um, we do not want that newness to come into the world because that spoils the pleasure in some ways.
mm,
That's the struggle of the modern man in some senses, that he wants the pleasure without that accompaniment or that struggle with something new in some senses. And that is where I think the struggle begins. I think that is where he's trying to, I think, point us towards, uh, um, to think about what that struggle would involve when you completely, um, you know sort of, not in some senses, and that is what I think Lacan's sexuality is all about in many ways. Lacan's sexuality, that there's others through which you have to maintain that sexual relationship, otherwise it becomes masturbatory in nature. And you think about Freud and Lacan, that's what they're trying to get at, that you need to develop a relationship with the other in some sense. When you read
mm.
this, he says the last one individual of the human species will follow the footsteps of Seth and bear Seth's mysteries. There will be no other offspring of the species, and he will be its seed. His sister will be born with him and he will emerge after her, his head lying at his feet. He will be born in China. Infertility will spread among men and women, and there will be many marriages without procreation. He will call them to God, but they will not respond. When God will make him and the believers of his time die, those who remain will live like animals, not permitting the lawful, So, how do we think through that point where nothing new would come on the earth in that sense? What is that point of the human being at which I think nothing new can enter into this world, and and how do we think through that? I think as we read further, a lot of this would become clearer to us. I'm just
Mhm.
saying, but that is a setting in which we can think through that problem in some senses, you
Yeah.
know,
Hmm.
and then
Yeah. Thinking about at what point we would stop, we would become sterile and not be able to produce anything and come up with
yeah.
anything.
Mhm.
I wonder. I mean, because you kind of already hinted about it earlier. You said knowledge already right now is we're accumulating, but it's almost like it's coming to this like pass. This end, um, which it always reminds me of quantum physics with how much bewildered they are about when they have to self-reflect about, wait a second, when I look at this thing, is it the thing that is actually moving, or is it me that's interfering with the thing that's moving it? When they start asking those questions, I feel like those are questions that should be taken seriously, because if we are, as Ibn Rabi says, that our predispositions are sort of like these ways of only knowing the or innately knowing the reality, then our knowledge that we have gained is not aimed directly at ourselves. And I guess the real question that becomes aimed at is, what is our knowledge being aimed at right now? What are we aiming at? Um, if we're denying anything as such, any unity, anything, what is it aimed at? I don't know what it's aimed at. Um, and so it does strike that question of man becoming sterile, and I think Nietzsche came at the perfect time to sort of provoke these things about becoming more, overman and so on, and Ibn Rabi with his new man. So um,
Definitely, and I think a paragraph above it, he says, but in exceptional cases, the right side appears the right side. All this applies to the traits of the essence of the plane, wherein things appear. This is the plane which he compared to mirror. Whoever knows his predisposition knows that which he receives. Not everyone who knows that which he receives knows his predisposition, except after he receives. Even though he knows this in a general way. And that is where I think you come back to your earlier questions of predisposition, I think, and that is where he enters into this paragraph. However, for some people of speculation who are weak-minded hold that sense, you know. So, in what ways is the struggle with oneself actually involves this honesty with oneself about knowing what you know in that sense and what you don't know in that sense? What does that honesty entail, that when you're reading a book, when you're reading, so for instance, a lot of times I find young minds getting enticed with this knowledge of everything in something. They feel that there's certain big mysteries will open up once they've read Hegel, or once they've read Kant, or once they've read Freud, or you know in that sense. But how do you reorient yourself to what you know in philosophy today, to read them in a very particular way, with
mm,
the honesty that you know what you can know, and that will be enough for you to move forward. You will never know everything. In fact, a lot of our philosophical writing is of that nature also today, where you have to show that you know everything.
yeah.
If you really read your philosophical writing today in that sense, it's a writing which is trying to show that you know everything. No, and one of the writers that I really admire a lot for actually being able to find a way forward from this kind of a dilemma is actually Hannah Arendt. If you read her writing, she's extremely honest about It's really endearing to read her because she's not trying to pretend to know anything in that sense. There is that pretension doesn't exist in her. You know, Um,
Hey,
I think
could
that's
you could you say
yeah,
the name again?
Hannah Arendt.
Oh, Hannah Arendt. Oh,
Yeah,
okay,
you know,
okay, yeah, okay, yeah. I'll have to read her.
you know. Look, for her, as you rightly said, for her, this is not really trying to reconcile any of these things. There is no, that is why she doesn't have a system. Like Lacan would have a system, Hegel would have a system. They would write in a system. She has no system at all. She would just write the way she has read things, and
Mm. Mm, yeah, but this idea of not reconciling is such a good step to begin with, because even in and this is the funny things that that I've heard Lacan say, and just like other things about, like, even the concept of like sin, for example. Like, if I were to find a fault within myself, and I go, oh, I must get rid of that thing, I must do something active to get rid of this fault of mine, I fall into some paradox where all I do is I keep recreating that fault over and over again, right? And
exactly.
and uh and this is the and I would keep laughing at myself when I would read, was it right now I'm reading The Cloud of Unknowing, which is a very like Christian Gnostic text, but it points out these contradictions, that the more you strive to get rid of your sin, the more you are involved in your sin. Like, you just keep doing it over and over again. Um, so it's interesting to think about, okay, I have this fault. And it's like, just when you don't try to, like, I guess, actively push it away, or some type of fashion like that, it just goes away on its own. you know? So it's interesting to think that way.
it, it takes a lot more work to be able to hold it, to actually enjoy seeing it in some senses, to actually creatively engage with it rather than simply trying to do away with it. It's much more easy to get into that zone where you think, oh, I have this fault, I need to improve myself, and I need to, find some kind of solution so that it would vanish in me and so on and so forth. It never vanishes in that manner. It
Mhm.
only vanishes when the background against which that fault is being interpreted changes. Because it's never the fault that is that big problem. It's the background against which you're interpreting it that is the big problem for you. As you think about it as a subject. As a subject, it's the background which really haunts you. That is this the only way I can actually encounter my own fault? That haunts you as a.
Mhm. Mhm. It's actually, in a very weird way, it's almost like, by acknowledging the fault and trying to get rid of it, it's actually a way of being dishonest about who you really are. and
Exactly.
that's the contradiction.
Contradiction.
Yeah.
You have to be radically honest to the background in which you're interpreting those things. It's
Mhm.
not simply that there is a fault. That is never in itself the complete story in that sense. You can never get that story without an interpretive background behind it, and that's the challenge of that. You don't know the world simply as it is. Even when you are actually looking at your own fault, you're actually looking at your own predisposition towards that fault also.
Yes. Yes.
You know.
Yes.
you
Yes.
know
Mm.
that's where things should become clearer to you in some
Mhm.
senses.
Yeah. Actually, that's such a good point, because I've been reading William James' Variety of Religious Experience, and he brilliantly points this out, how there are certain natures or temperaments that would completely change your experience of God, or have their perception of God, where what he calls like the healthy minded temperament always tries to minimize evil. They don't like to look at suffering. They don't like to acknowledge suffering that much. They say, oh, don't look at that, pay attention to this unity and da da da. But the more melancholy temperament, they're like, how can I deny that all of this is here? you know So it's interesting how all that temperament plays a role in our interpretive background. Like you're talking about, and for me, it's such a important topic to think about because even though a philosopher could tell me, yeah, but your theory of predisposition or temperament is a theory too, he could say that. But like you said, it could just be his temperament playing a role in that in that interpretation. So there's always, this funny cycle that we get caught in when we're sort of trying to be, clever about the way we approach things. Um, when it's the only thing we're ever actually confronting is ourselves, but we're just not being honest about it, like you had said. You know.
Yeah, I think. mm,
What do you think, Jitan?
Yeah, no, I think as we move forward in the text, I think that it's going to be very fun text in that sense to we will read through these, you know, these forms of questioning from that lens in that sense, that honesty about our predispositions, you know. And I think it's a struggle that at least I am personally very, very interested in because it doesn't it doesn't allow you to in some senses, simply be oriented towards knowledge without actually investing who you are in it in some sense.
Mhm.
In some sense, it doesn't allow that knowledge, and and Hegel, I think, got it right when he said that that is where abstraction lies. You need to make things concrete for yourself. Determinate negation of Hegel actually is that process of making things concrete for yourself, and I think that's the struggle that we all endure in. That how do we work through these things without making them abstract for us, without simply letting them become
Mhm.
externalized to us.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think we could. I
Yeah,
think we could end there.
yeah, we can in there. Yeah, we can
Yeah.
read the next third chapter next week, I guess. It's been really interesting. Thanks, Javier.
Yeah.
Thanks
Yeah.
so
No
much.
problem. All right. Thank you guys for watching.
Yeah, thank
This
you.